So this investigation concerns the reasons and modalities through which power has taken in Western societies the form of an economy, that is to say, of a government of men and things. So we'll not speak about power in general, but about a peculiar form of power, the modern form of power, that is to say, government. Of course, I will therefore have to carry on Michel Foucault's enquiries in the genealogy of governments. As you probably know, starting from the mid of the 70s, Foucault began to work on what he called le gouvernement des hommes. So I will carry on and continue his research, but I will also try to dislocate them in a different context. Foucault once wrote that his historical investigations were only the shadow of his theoretical questioning of the present. And I completely share this point of view. Also for me, the historical investigation I have to do are just the shadow cast from my interrogation of the present. And in my case, this shadow becomes longer and reaches back to the very beginning of Christian theology. I will try to show that two paradigms derive from Christian theology, from early Christian theology. Political theology, which grounds in the one God, the transcendence of sovereign power, and this is the new thing, the economical theology, which bases itself on the notion of an oikonomia, an economy conceived as an immanent order, domestic and not property political, of both human and divine life. The first paradigm is juridical or juridical political, and will give rise to the modern theory of sovereignty. The second one is managerial and will lead to modern biopolitics up to the present domination of economy and management over all aspects of social life. So the starting point of my investigation was the amazing discovery of the essential role played by the Greek term oikonomia, economy, in the strategy of the theologians who in the 2nd century of Christian era elaborated the doctrine of Trinity. You know that the Greek term oikonomia means the administration of the oikos, the house, and thus Aristotle can write that economy differs from politics in the same way as the oikos, the house, differs from the polis, the city. And that is why in the Aristotelian tradition there is a sharp opposition between economy and politics. From a Greek point of view, politics cannot be reduced to an economy. According to Aristotle, economy is a non-epistemic paradigm, something that is not a science, not an episteme, but a practice, which implies decisions and measures that can be understood only in relation to a given situation or to a given problem. So the best translation of the Greek term is therefore management. And by the way, this is the translation that you can find in the authoritative Greek-English dictionary published by Henry Liddell, who was the father of Alice, the little girl so tenderly loved and immortalized by Lewis Carroll. Yeah, the most authoritative Greek dictionary comes from the father of Alice, Carroll Ellis. Now, why did Christian theologians need this term, It's quite simple. Just when the Trinitarian doctrine begins to be developed, the theologians had to cope with the strong resistance within the Church of a group of reasonable people called the monarchians, that is to say, the partisan of the government of one, who thought, and they were probably right, that the introduction in God of three persons simply meant falling back to polytheism. Oikonomia, economy, is the concept by means of which theologians tried to reconcile in God the unity with the Trinity. Their argument was roughly, I simplify but it's like that, was roughly the following. God, as far as his substance or being is concerned, is absolutely one. But as for his oikonomia, his economy, that is to say, the way he manages the divine house and life, he is three. Just as the master, this was the argument, just as the master of a house can share the administration with the son or with other persons without losing the unity of his power, in the same way, God can trust the management of the world and the salvation of man to his Son, the Christ. St. Paul, in his letters, had spoken, referring to redemption, of an economy of the mystery, an economy of the mystery of the salvation. Now, theologians such as Irenaeus, Hippolytus, and Tertullian reverse this expression, this very important strategic reversal, and speak, referring to the Trinity, of a mystery of the economy. So it's not God's being who is mysterious, its economy, its action, its activity is mysterious. And they distinguished in this sense two discourses, the theological or ontological discourse, which concerned God's being, and the economical discourse, which refers to God's action, to the way he manages the government of the world and the history of salvation. You see that the Trinity was introduced not in the beginning, not as a metaphysical doctrine, as it became later after the great church councils, but as an economy, as a managerial device. The hypothesis I'm trying to suggest is that this mystery of the economy has functioned as the hidden epistemological paradigm of modern governance. So I will use theology in order to better understand government. I'm not proposing a return to theology, not at all. I will just use theology to better understand governance. I cannot here bother you with the detailed reconstruction I had to do of this doctrine, which kept the Church Father busy for centuries. I will just attempt to summarize in a few points the main results of my investigation. So first of all, which kind of activity, which kind of praxis is the oikonomia, economy? What is the inner structure of an act of governance, of the divine management? And why is something such as a government of man possible? So let me analyze this, and I will propose 5 points which summarize in a way the results of my research. So the first point could be called the paradox of divine anarchy. As we saw, the doctrine of the divine economy was produced in order to save monotheism, but it ended up introducing into God a split, a division between being and action, ontology and economy. I mean that God's action, God's economy, according to the Fathers, has no foundation in its being. is, in this sense, as they said, literally, an anarchical mystery. Arche in Greek means beginning, foundation. And God's economy has no foundation, has no beginning. It's completely independent from God's being. And it becomes perfectly clear as we try to understand the meaning in this perspective of the great controversy on Arianism that so deeply divided the Church between the 4th and the 6th century. Why was the fight so merciless and long-lasting? It involved also the profane paradigm. The emperor took position. What was on stake in this debate? I will not enter all the theological details. What was on stake, the main point in the debate, was the anarchical character, that is to say, without arche, without foundation, without beginning, of the Son, the Christ. Arius, which became after an heretical, maintained that Christ, the Son, which was the logos, the word and the action of God, was grounded in the Father, was not anarchical like the Father, but he had its beginning and foundation in the Father. The prevailing doctrine, which became then the orthodoxy, stated firmly that the Son, the Christ, is anarchos, without beginning or foundation, exactly like the Father. So the Christ is completely independent, is a divine figure without beginning and without foundation in the Father. This thesis of the anarchy of the Christ is perhaps the most ominous inheritance that Christian theology bequeaths to modernity. Why? Because it implies that language and action, as the divine action, language and divine action, have no foundation in being, are in this sense anarchical. This means that classical ontology, Greek ontology, with its idea of a substantial link between being and logos, being and language, also between being and praxis, action, is ruined forever. Any attempt since that moment to found language on being is doomed to fail. You know, according to Aristotle, for instance, God moved the world, the heavens, but he didn't move because he wanted this. Its being coincided with his action. So the Christian fathers completely reversed this point of view. God's action has nothing to do with God's being. And this is the inheritance which we had to cope with, because then if action has no foundation in being, politics, ethics, etc., become extremely problematic. Moreover, it's precisely because being and action are both anarchical, in this sense. Precisely for that reason, something such as a government. You know that government comes from the Greek kybernetes, which means the pilot, the helmsman in a ship. So it has to do to guide the ship. So precisely because being and action are both anarchical, a government becomes possible and even necessary. It is the groundless or anarchical character of a human and divine action that makes it possible to govern this action. If action and being were the same, you couldn't govern the action. But this means, as a consequence, that economy, or oikonomia, that is to say governance, is essentially anarchical. that there is a secret solidarity between government and anarchy. There is a government only because the elements that constitute this government are anarchical, groundless. When one of the main characters in Pasolini's film Salò says that the only real anarchy is the anarchy of power, and when Benjamin writes that there is nothing so anarchical as the bourgeois order, their statement are to be taken extremely seriously. So there is a solidarity between governance and anarchy. So this was the first point. I'm trying to analyze the structure of an act of governance. This is the first point. So the second point, I will call it, there is a long development of this on my investigation, the kingdom and the government. So that is to say, the double structure of government. So one of the points who was to have a great impact on Western culture is the strategic conjunction of this doctrine of the divine economy with the theory of providence. That is to say, of the divine government of the world. Providence just means the divine government of the world. The coming together of these two paradigms, which have different origins, or providence also come from Greek Stoic philosophy, etc., is already accomplished in Clement of Alexandria at the end of the 2nd century. And through to the end of the 17th century, almost without interruption, it has given rise to an incredible amount of philosophical and theological literature. Perhaps providence is the subject on which philosophers and theologians have more written. Providence means, as you probably know, that God is constantly busy in governing the world. And if he would stop for a single instant, then the world would collapse. This is the theological basis of providence. But how does providence, how does this divine government of the world function? So since the beginning, this is a very, very important point, we see that providence is conceived as a double or bipolar machine. That's a constant. So since the beginning of the theory, we have a double structure. God does not govern the world directly in all details, up to the last small animal or insect or sparrow, as the Gospel says. But God governs the world through universal principles. Theologians distinguish, therefore, between a general providence, which establishes the universal law and universal and transcendent laws and the first causes, and they call this ordinatio, ordering, the order. And then a special providence that is entrusted to the angels or to the mechanism of immanent and secondary causes. And they will call this execution, executio. So the machine of divine government is a general law and execution. Probably you recognize the democratic model. So no matter how theologians conceive of the relation between these two poles, in any case, the bipolar structure must be present. If they are completely divided, no government is possible. There will be on one side an all-might sovereign who is effectively impotent, and on the other, the chaotic mass of the particular acts of intervention and governance. A government is possible only if the two aspects are coordinated in a bipolar machine. So I will define government when you will have the coordination of these two elements, a general law and an execution, general providence and particular providence. In the tradition of political philosophy, we could say that this double structure is expressed in the old formula, the king reigns, but he does not govern. This is an old dictum which already found in the 16th century. In the tradition of modern democracy, we have to think to the division between legislative or sovereign power, which acts always through universal laws and principles, and executive power, which carries out in detail the general principle. It's one thing that's very amazing, that the first time we find this vocabulary, ordinatio and executio, order and execution, is in theology and not in political theory. We are here many, many centuries before that political theory articulates this. And you will see one of the discovery of my investigation is that vocabulary of public law administration is strongly linked to theological origins. Anyway, in this case, it's very clear, ordinatio and executio. So I would say that history of Western politics is precisely the history of the various and changing articulations, also conflict, naturally, of these two poles of power, reign and government, sovereignty and economy, the father and the son, law and order, law and police, we could also say. But anyway, this bipolar character must be there and remains there up to the end. Today we could say that the pole of government or execution has the primacy. It's clear, no? The crisis of parliamentary and legislative power is evident everywhere. I don't know if in India it's like that, but I mean, it does not exist anymore in Europe or the United States. No? You have an absolute primacy of government. But anyway, even in this case, both poles are there. So one pole can prevail on the other, like now is the case for government and executive power, but nevertheless they must be there. Otherwise there is no government. There is another form of power. So the third point, so we have two first definitions. The third point, I would call it the paradigm of collateral damage. In the history of the doctrine of providence, the most tantalizing aporia is perhaps the problem of the origin of evil, which will engage theologians and philosophers for centuries. If God governs the world, and if God's economy is necessarily the most perfect one, how can we explain evil in all its aspects? Natural catastrophes, illness, moral crimes, etc. So this problem really kept busy philosophers and theologians for centuries. And the attempt to find a solution to this aporia resulted in the invention of a paradigm that is perhaps the most significant theological legacy of the contemporary theory of governance. The argument was the following. God, in his providence, establishes general laws which are always good. Evil results from these laws as a collateral effect. The Greek term is really absolutely literally this, as kata epakolotusesis, as a collateral effect, as a side effect of the divine government of the world. So the evil is just a side effect of the good government. Thus, so we made a lot of examples. So, thus, from the general laws of the movement of the bodies and of the warming of earth comes the rain, which is in itself very good. But as a collateral effect, you may have storms and floods, and rain will fall where it should not have fallen. So this is just, so you see, it's a collateral effect of a good thing. Alexander of Aphrodisia, who was a late Aristotelian commentator around the 2nd century after Christ, expounded this theory in a form which is particularly relevant for our purpose. God, he argues, cannot bother himself with details. Therefore, each act of the divine world government, as we saw, is directed to a primary and general end. But just as the head of a house, providing food for his family, feeds also as a side effect the little animals, the ants, the worms, and the rats who live in the house, in the same way, the general act of divine providence will result in collateral effects which can be positive, and then you will have then the paradigm of liberalism, or negative. Alexander argues, and this is a very important point, that collateral effects are not accidental, but define the very structure of the act of governance. Neither general nor particular, neither intentional nor casual, neither foreseen nor unforeseen, neither reign nor government, the collateral effect is the way in which the divine government becomes effective, in which providence realizes itself. And only in this form can the governmental machine, which always moves otherwise on two separate levels, general and particular, but only as a side effect, the machine can become operative. When today military strategies give the name collateral damages, or in French, bavure, to the calculated side effects of a military intervention, which can result in the destruction of cities and in human casualties, they unwittingly develop this very old theological paradigm. But if our hypothesis is correct, also in this case, the collateral effect is not something secondary or casual, but defines the very essence of an act of governance. There are no casualities in the act of governance, because the act aims to collateral effects. So, I mean, in a way, the military, when an American strategist says, we killed 1,000 persons, this was just a collateral effect of good action. We have to reverse. So it's true, but the collateral effect is the way in which government, the act of governance is realized. So that's another, now the fourth point. This is a point which already Michel Foucault has emphasized. The character which defines the divine government of the world is that providence cannot be simply an act of force, of violence, which abolishes and subdues the free will of the governed ones. The main character of the divine government is that it works through the very nature of the creatures, such that, as a 17th century theologian, French theologian Bossuet puts it, God makes the world as if God were absent from it. It's an incredibly intelligent thing. God governs the creatures as if they freely govern themselves. I quote, because this is just the extreme formulation of a very old theological theory. I quote, God allows us to be as we could be on our own. God allows to be a man what is a man, a body what is a body, thought what is thought, necessary what is necessary, and free what is free. So this incredibly sophisticated fiction, this subtle economy of power, according to which God, in order to govern absolutely, must act as if the creatures were governing themselves, strongly influenced authors such as Rousseau. Rousseau was deeply influenced by a French theoretician of the Providence, Malebranche, who is the one who invented the theory of volonté générale, general will. And in this way, especially through Rousseau, this idea became the theological paradigm of modern democratic theory, according to which the governed govern themselves. So the fifth and last point, that is to say, with that has to do with the vicarious character of governmental power. Governmental power, governments, is essentially a vicarious power. In which sense? In the eschatological messianic kingdom of which Paul speaks in the first letter to the Corinthians, Christ receives his power from the Father and will therefore, after subduing all earthly power, return the kingdom to him. And Paul says exactly like that. The Son will reign up the moment he destroys all earthly power, then he will give back the power to the Father. But we saw, so the messianic power of Christ seems thus to be a vicarious power exerted in the name of the Father. But we saw that in the Trinitarian economy, each divine person, and especially the Son, is anarchical, has no foundation in the Father. The intra-Trinitarian relation between the Father and the Son can be considered in this sense as the theological paradigm of the intrinsically vicarious character of governmental power. Trinitarian economy is the expression of an anarchical power which moves to and fro through the divine persons according to an essentially vicarious paradigm. So there is no way to assign to one person the origin and foundation of power. Power has a Trinitarian form, circulates vicariously in this form. And this is why the supreme sovereign power in the history of Western politics presents itself as vicarious. You probably know that in the history of Western politics, especially the moment of the struggle between the Pope and the Emperor, both the Emperor and the Pope claimed for themselves the title of Vicarius Christi, or Vicarius Dei, and the Vicar of Christ, the Vicar of God. So the Emperor would say, I am the Vicar of God. And the Pope said, no, I am the Vicar of God. But more deeply, this is also why in Western public law, the source of power is in the last resort impossible to ascribe, and moves always in a circle between, for instance, a very important point, constitutive and constituted power, sovereignty and execution, legislation and police. And in the end, it's impossible to ascribe also the final responsibility to someone, because the power has a deeply vicarious structure. So you will never say who in the last end has the power. To move always in a dialectics between the two poles. And this is especially true to understand this very important character of the modern political theory, public law theory, the difference between constitutive and constituted power. But they also move in this circle. So apparently constituted power is founded by the constituent power, but then when you try to grasp it, you will see that there is an unceasing, continuous dialectical movement between the two powers. Because governmental power is essentially vicarious. So if I've chosen to, so this is the five character through which I try to define an act of governance. You will have understood it if I've chosen to locate my genealogy of modern governments in a theological context. This is because there, the peculiar bipolar structure of governmental power is perfectly evident. One of the main results of my investigation is that the history of Western politics is the history of the crossing and intertwining of two divided and yet inseparable paradigms: reign and government, or kingdom and governments, the father and the son, sovereignty and economy, law and order, legitimacy and legality. And we can now better understand why the fundamental problem of Western public law has the form how to ground government in sovereignty, how to ground order in law, economical praxis in juridical patterns, legality in legitimacy. And it's a very big problem in political theory. Modern democracy can be seen from this perspective as the desperate attempt to link in a stable structure the two anarchical poles of the machine. But this is precisely why democracy is so fragile, always oscillating between a lack and an excess of government, always looking for a Holy Spirit or a charismatic principle that could be able to keep together the anarchical powers that it has inherited from Christian theology. With few exceptions, modern political scientists and political philosophers fail to confront both poles of the governmental machine. Beginning with Rousseau, modern theorists tend to consider sovereignty as the central political category and to reduce government to executive power. As a result, political philosophy, and this is especially true for the democratic tradition, fails to understand the real nature of government and focuses instead on universal problems such as law, state, sovereign body. What my investigation has shown is that, on the contrary, the real problem, the secret core of politics, is neither sovereignty nor law. It is government. It is not the king, but rather the minister. It is not God, but rather the angels. It is not law, but rather the police and the state of exception. Or, more precisely, it is the governmental machine that functions through the complicated system of relations that binds these two poles together. Because the punishment of the damned has to be carried on infinitely, so while in paradise angels work no more, in the hell the devils work a lot in order to execute the divine justice. There is also, because the study of theology is really amusing in some way, also there is a great discussion about the fact, are the holy in the heaven, will the holy in the heaven look at the punishment of the bad guys damned in the hell? And the answer is yes, and they will take joy from this. So, the second point, so this first point, important to me, the second point, As you know, the essential function and duty of the Church is liturgy, is the divine service. Now, if we examine Christian liturgy, we discover that it is made essentially by formulas and chants of glorification, or as they are technically named in theology, by doxologies. And doxa means glory, so these are called doxologies. Thus, for instance, probably we are not familiar with the Christian Mass, but anyway, the Mass, the Christian Mass, is just a succession of doxologies and acclamation, such as blessed be his name, glory to God forever and ever, gloria Dei in saecula saeculorum, alleluia, praise be to God, sanctus, sanctus, cantus, sanctus, Kyrie eleison, holy, holy, holy. Just the Mass, if you see what is done, how it's done, is just a series of doxologies and acclamations, as they are called. Quite surprisingly, these acclamations or doxology are exactly the same as those found in the ceremonies of Roman emperors and in the rituals of Byzantine court liturgy. This relationship between the profane and the ecclesiastical ceremonial is so tight that historians are puzzled when they have to distinguish the one from the other. There are big problems. This formula is profane, comes from the emperor or from the church. For instance, you know the Mass ends with the formula ite, missa est, go, the Mass is finished. This was the formula who ended when the emperor received people. Then at the end he said ite, missa est. So, for instance, Ernst Kantorowicz, the great historian, in his 1946 book Laudes Rege, reconstructs the history of a liturgical acclamation, which has the form Christus vincit, Christus regnat, Christus imperat, Christ wins, Christ reigns, Christ commands. Now, not only this acclamation is from the beginning a feature of both profane and religious ceremonies, but in the 20th century it also plays an important role in the fascist power rituals. Pope Pius XI and Benito Mussolini, the fascist duce, came to power in the same year, 1922. In order to respond to the new political fascist challenge, the Pope introduced the feast of Christus Rex, Christ the King, which included and revived this old acclamation, Christ wins, Christ reigns. Only a few years later, this acclamation was picked up by the fascist militia in the Spanish Civil War and then included in fascist public ceremonies, adding the name of Benito Mussolini. Thus, I decided to focus my investigations on the political meaning of acclamations. My question was, why does power need glory? If power is essentially economy, that is to say, force and ability to govern, why has it to take the stiff, cumbersome, and glorious form of ceremonies, protocols, liturgies? The more easy sociological answer, yes, of course, is done for instrumental reason. But it is, no, if we are on this level, the link is much more deep. So in the attempt to answer these questions, I came upon two books which provided me with a decisive orientation. I refer to the unfinished dissertation on prayer by the great French anthropologist Marcel Mauss, published in 1968, and the Verfassungslehre, literally the doctrine of constitution or public law, by the German jurist Carl Schmitt, who in the 30s, as you know, compromised with the Nazi regime. Marcel Mauss, for Facebook, defines prayer, which of course includes doxologies. Doxology is a form of prayer. A prayer is a form of doxology. So Mauss defines prayer as an oral rite. As such, it is a powerful and effective act whose aim is to affect and influence the holy beings, the gods. Mauss had been guided in his investigation by a book by the great French Indologist Sylvain Lévy, the 1899 book, The Doctrine of Sacrifice in the Brahmanas. Sylvain Lévy shows that according to Vedic theologians, this time no more Christian, Vedic theologians, the sacrifice not only acts upon the gods, but even creates them. Sacrifice, Lévy writes, I quote, is not only the author of the gods, it is itself a god, the god par excellence who always dies and always returns to life. And another great French sociologist, Émile Durkheim, had written in his classic work on elementary forms of religious life, I quote, "Man cannot live without gods, but it is no less true that gods would die if they did not receive their cult. Cult has not only the function to connect the profane and the sacred, it also keeps gods alive. It unceasingly regenerates and revives them." End quotes. Then there was also a very interesting book by a specialist of a Jewish Kabbalah who shows that all Kabbalah has the function of making the gods. But then, from this perspective, acclamations, and more generally, all rituals aiming to God's glorification are not, as theologians claim, a consequence of divine power and glory. On the contrary, they produce and nourish them. This means that also profane acclamations and ceremonies, of which sovereign powers is so eager, are not an outcome of power, but rather what generates or feeds power. Now, for the second book, Carl Schmitt's Doctrine of the Constitution. What struck me in this book was his amazing analysis of the juridical value of acclamations. I already knew that in ancient Rome, as you probably know, the emperor was formally invested with the title of Caesar by the army, by the soldiers, and that this ceremony of investiture had the technical form of an acclamation. So the emperor was acclamated emperor by the soldier. And this was technically the investiture. The acclamations and doxologies in the church liturgy also could be seen as the expression of the consensus of the people of the believers. But Schmitt tries to link this old juridical political phenomenon with modern democracies and defines the acclamation as the pure and immediate expression of the people as holder of constituent power. I quote, "The acclamation," he writes, "is the original and eternal phenomenon of every political community. No state without people, no people without acclamation." So I began to think that acclamation was a very serious thing. Perhaps one can think that today we have no more acclamations. So anyway, you know how strong was the function of acclamation in totalitarian regime. No? No acclamation was so important as Heil Hitler in the German regime or Duce Duce in the Italian fascist acclamation. No? But one could see that is no more the case. But on the contrary, it is the case. Schmidt claims that in modern democracies, this original phenomenon survives in the form of public opinion. That is to say, that public opinion is the modern form of acclamation. I think that this time also he's right. So if this be true, then the sphere of glory does not disappear in modern democracy, but rather it is simply displaced in another and wider sphere. And if the media are so important in modern democracy, technically, juridically important, this is not simply because they allow to control and govern public opinion, but also because in this way they distribute and bestow glory. We could even say that modern society is a glorious society, the most glorious society ever in the history, in which the function of glory frees itself from its traditional link with liturgy and spreads over every aspect of social life. The liturgies and ceremonies in the ancient regime were limited to certain moments, but now the media spread the glory in every moment of social life. And from this point of view, what Guy Debord calls société du spectacle, spectacular society, you know, Guy Debord's definition, the last phase of capitalism is a spectacular society. So this is a society in which glory becomes indiscernible from economy and government. The identification of economy and glory in the acclamatory form of media and consensus is, in this sense, the salient feature of a contemporary democracy. So now, I'm afraid that my attempt to sum up in a short lecture the result of research of many years was an impossible task. Through this theological pattern of economy, I tried to cast some light on the modern figure of a power, that is to say, governance. But in the end, this figure showed itself to be inseparable from glory, and even to be essentially the same as glory. The relationship between economy and glory is, in this sense, the very core of the Western modern governmental machine. The ultimate figure of power is therefore not government and action, but rather inoperativity and inaction. And what glory has to cover with its splendor, what power can neither think nor accept, is the end of government, is divine inaction or leisure. Or, to put it differently, the aim of glory is perhaps to capture and control this inactivity and to transform it into the secret and precious nourishment